corrupt judge accused her of theft, until the humble woman said something unexpected. Mrs. Helen Johnson clutched her old leather purse tightly as she waited for her turn to be called in the crowded Denver courthouse. At 72, she never imagined she would be there, accused of a crime she would never commit. Her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness, but her grey eyes held the serenity of someone who had lived long enough to know the truth always finds its way. The trouble had begun 3 weeks earlier, when security cameras at a luxury jewelry store downtown captured an elderly woman allegedly stealing a diamond necklace worth $50,000. The image was blurry, but the physical resemblance to Mrs. Helen was enough for them to accuse her. Now facing Judge Richard Harrison, one of the most feared judges in the district, she felt the weight of an injustice that seemed impossible to overturn. The defendant, Helen Marie Johnson, is accused of grand theft, declared the magistrate in a stern voice, banging his gavel on the desk with unnecessary force. The evidence is clear and indisputable. Mrs. Helen shook her head in denial, but her words seemed to find no place in that hostile environment. Beside her, the court-appointed lawyer, Jennifer, a recently graduated young woman who seemed more nervous than her own client, shuffled papers with trembling fingers. "Your Honor, I request that my client be heard," Jennifer murmured, her voice barely audible. "The accused will have her chance to speak when I say so," the judge snapped, not even looking at the defender. In the audience, murmurs of disapproval echoed. Most of the people there had already condemned the elderly woman in their minds. After all, who would believe the word of a simple retired cleaning lady over the cameras of a reputable store? Prosecutor Michael Thompson rose gracefully, adjusting his expensive suit before addressing the jury. He was an ambitious man, known for never losing a case, no matter the means. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have a crystal-clear situation here," he began, pointing to the screen showing the blurry video. The defendant was caught on security equipment, leaving the jewelry store in a hurry at the exact moment the piece was reported missing. Mrs. Helen watched everything with a mix of sadness and indignation. She knew that kind of attitude all too well. For 40 years working as a housekeeper in family homes, she had witnessed similar injustices. She was always the first to be suspected when something went missing, always the last to have her word taken seriously. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, pacing dramatically around the room, we have the testimony of the store manager, who claims to have seen the defendant behaving suspiciously near the counter where the stolen piece was displayed. The manager in question, Amanda Wilson, a middle-aged woman with an arrogant air, waved from the audience as if she were a celebrity. She had insisted from day one that Mrs. Helen was guilty, despite never having seen her before the alleged incident. Judge Richard Harrison watched everything with a stern expression, his dark eyes fixed on the accused in a way that seemed to pierce through her. There was something in his gaze that went beyond professional severity. It was almost personal, as if the presence of that woman deeply disturbed him. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Mrs. Helen rose slowly, leaning on the cane she carried due to her knee problems. She was a small woman, short in stature, but she radiated a dignity that years of hard work had failed to break. "Doctor, I swear on my late mother's soul that I never entered that store," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "On the day they're talking about, I was at the hospital with my little granddaughter." "Hospital records can easily be forged," interrupted the judge before she could finish. "We need more concrete evidence." The attorney Jennifer tried to intervene but was silenced with an impatient gesture. It was clear the magistrate had already made up his mind before hearing all the testimonies. From the back of the room, Mrs. Helen's daughter, Sarah, 45, watched with a heavy heart. She worked as a nurse at 2 hospitals to support her family and knew her mother was telling the truth. She had arrived late to the hearing due to her shift, but carried all the medical documentation that would prove her mother's innocence. "May I present the hospital records, Your Honor?" Sarah stood up, holding a folder full of papers. "Sit down," ordered the judge without even looking her way. "You weren't called to speak." The tension in the room was palpable. Several people in the audience began murmuring, disturbed by the magistrate's authoritarian demeanor. A long-time court clerk, Mrs. Bennett, who had worked there for over 20 years, whispered to her colleague, "I've never seen Judge Richard act like this. He's always been strict, but this is just strange." During the 15-minute recess, Mrs. Helen remained seated on the bench while her daughter Sarah approached her. "Mom, I brought all the hospital papers," Sarah whispered, discreetly showing the folder. "It even has the time you arrived and left, the medical staff's signatures." "Sweetheart, that man had already decided to convict me before this hearing even started," replied Mrs. Helen, staring at the judge as he spoke quietly with the prosecutor. "There's something very odd about all this." It was true. From the moment Mrs. Helen had entered the room, the magistrate's behavior had changed drastically. He, who was usually tough but fair, now seemed driven by something personal, almost as if the woman's presence had sparked an inexplicable anger in him. "Have you seen this judge before, Mom?" Sarah asked, following her mother's gaze. "I don't know, dear." Mrs. Helen hesitated, a shadow crossing her eyes. "There's something familiar about him, but I can't place it." When the hearing resumed, the prosecutor called another witness, the jewelry store security guard, Mark Peterson, a burly man who walked with an air of importance to the witness stand. "Can you describe what you saw on the day in question?" asked Michael Thompson. "Yes, Mr. Prosecutor," replied Mark, adjusting his too-tight suit. "I saw a grey-haired woman, short, wearing simple clothes, handling the expensive necklaces at the counter. When the manager checked, the piece was gone." "And can you identify that person in the room?" Mark pointed directly at Mrs. Helen without hesitation. But there was something rehearsed in his gesture, as if he had memorized those words. "Your Honor, I'd like to question the witness," Jennifer requested, gathering her courage. "Denied," the judge responded immediately. "The testimony is clear." The outrage in the audience was becoming evident. Several people whispered about the obvious bias in the trial. Mrs. Bennett, the veteran court clerk, decided to act. During another brief recess, she discreetly approached Sarah. "Miss, I've worked here a long time," she whispered. "I've never seen Judge Richard behave like this. Something is very wrong. You need a real lawyer, not this inexperienced girl." "We don't have the money for a private attorney," Sarah replied, her voice thick with desperation. "Then you need to find another way to prove your mother's innocence," said Mrs. Bennett, looking worriedly at the judge who was returning. "Because the way things are going, she'll be convicted today." The afternoon wore on, and the trial took an increasingly ominous turn. Judge Richard seemed determined to speed up the process, systematically denying every defense request while accepting everything from the prosecution. "Let's move to closing arguments," he announced, banging his gavel. "The prosecutor may proceed." Michael Thompson stood up again, a victorious smile already on his face. To him, this was just another case won, another step up the ladder of professional success. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts are undeniable," he declared, gesturing broadly. "We have video evidence, we have witnesses, we have opportunity. The defendant, a woman in financial distress, saw the jewelry store as a chance to solve her problems unlawfully." Mrs. Helen felt as though each word was a stab to her heart. The way they described her bore no resemblance to the reality of a woman who had worked honestly her entire life, raised 3 children through sheer hard work, and never taken a single penny that wasn't hers. "I request the defendant be sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law," concluded the prosecutor, returning to his table with a triumphant air. Now it was the defense's turn. Jennifer stood up on shaky legs, knowing she had little to work with, especially given the clear bias of the trial. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "The prosecution's case rests solely on a blurry image and testimony that hasn't been properly challenged. My client is an elderly woman, a hard worker, with no criminal record." "A lack of a record doesn't mean a lack of guilt," the judge interrupted coldly. "But, Your Honor, if you'd allow me to present the medical records proving she was elsewhere at the time of the alleged crime." "I've already ruled those documents lack sufficient evidentiary value." Jennifer looked desperately at Sarah, who was gesturing toward the folder with the evidence. It was infuriating to have concrete proof of innocence and not be able to present it properly. "Your Honor, at least allow the defendant to make her final statement," the young lawyer pleaded. The judge hesitated for a moment, staring intently at Mrs. Helen. There was something in his eyes as if he were wrestling internally, two opposing forces battling for control. "You may speak," he said finally, though his tone remained hostile. Mrs. Helen rose slowly, leaning on her cane. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even those who had arrived convinced of her guilt began to question what they were witnessing. "Judge," she began, looking directly into the magistrate's eyes, "I am 72 years old. I've worked since I was 12, as a maid, a laundress, a cleaner, always honestly. I raised 3 children alone after my husband abandoned us. Never in my life have I taken what wasn't mine." The emotion in her voice was genuine, moving even some who had initially regarded her with suspicion. "On the day they're talking about, I was at the hospital," she continued, "with my 6-year-old granddaughter who had pneumonia. I have all the proof, but you refuse to see it." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat but kept his expression stern. "I know I'm just a poor old woman, uneducated, unimportant to society," Mrs. Helen went on, her voice gaining strength. "But I have dignity, and that dignity won't let me accept a false accusation without fighting back." For the first time since the trial began, Judge Richard seemed genuinely unsettled. Her hands, which once gestured firmly, now trembled slightly. "You've said enough," he murmured. "No, Judge," Mrs. Helen replied with a courage that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm not finished yet." The impact of those words echoed through the room like thunder. No one had ever challenged Judge Richard Harrison like that, especially not a defendant during her own trial. "How dare you!" he exploded, rising from his chair, his face red with anger. "I decide when you're done speaking." "You may decide many things in this courtroom," Mrs. Helen said, maintaining the calm that only years of experience could bring, "but you can't silence the truth forever." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Sarah was ready to run to her mother, fearing the situation might spiral out of control. Jennifer watched the scene in horror, unsure how to intervene. "I'll hold you in contempt," shouted the judge, his gavel raised in the air. "Do what you must with me, Judge," Mrs. Helen replied. And then something shifted in her eyes. "But first, let me tell you a story." "I don't want to hear any story. It's about a boy," she continued, ignoring his protests. "A very clever but very sad boy who lived in a big, beautiful house, empty of love." The gavel, poised to strike, hung suspended in the air. Judge Richard had frozen completely, as if he'd seen a ghost. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority. "Of course you do," Mrs. Helen replied with a sad smile. "Because that boy grew up to become an important man, a man who forgot where he came from and who cared for him when no one else did." The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something far greater than a simple theft trial. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing. "You're delusional," the judge murmured, but his hands were visibly shaking now. "I'm not delusional, my son," Mrs. Helen said, and for the first time her tone was tender. "I'm remembering a time when you called me Nanny Helen." The gavel slipped from the magistrate's hands, landing on the desk with a sharp thud. Several people in the audience whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what was happening. "This is impossible," he stammered. "You were 7 when I came to work in your father's house," Mrs. Helen continued, slowly walking toward the judge's bench. "It was 1965. The house was on Maple Avenue, number 247. A huge house with a garden in front and a pool in the back." With each word, the judge's face grew paler. Sarah stared at her mother in shock. She had never heard this story before. "Your father, Dr. Edward Harrison, was a very wealthy but very busy man," Mrs. Helen went on. "Your mother had left when you were just a baby. You were alone with the maids, but they never stayed long." "Stop this," he whispered. "You were a difficult child, son. You threw tantrums, broke things, screamed. The adults said you were spoiled, but I knew you were just a boy suffering for lack of love." Tears welled in the magistrate's eyes as he struggled to maintain his composure in front of everyone. "I remember the first day you accepted me," she continued, now very close to the bench. You had broken an expensive vase in the living room and were hiding under the stairs, afraid of your father's scolding. Please, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I knelt down, looked into your frightened little eyes and said, Don't worry, my angel. Nanny Helen is here now and she'll take care of you. You stopped crying right then. Emotion filled the entire room. Many people had tears in their eyes, moved by the scene unfolding before them. We told your father it was an accident, that the vase fell off the shelf by itself, Mrs. Helen continued. It was our first little lie together, remember? Judge Richard could no longer hold back his tears, which streamed freely down his face. Nanny, he murmured, his voice choked. That's right, my boy, she said, reaching out to touch his face. Your Nanny Helen. The same one who bathed you, helped you with homework, made up stories to put you to sleep. The transformation in the magistrate was visible. The authoritarian, cruel man had disappeared, replaced by a wounded boy who had rediscovered the mother figure of his childhood. But how? Why didn't you look for me sooner? He asked, holding her hands in his. I did try, Richard, she replied tenderly. Many times over the years. But you had become an important man, and I was still just a housekeeper. Your secretaries never let me through. The revelation hit the judge like a punch to the gut. How many times had he ordered unimportant people to be turned away without knowing who they were? I tried to speak with you last week when I heard I'd be tried here, Mrs. Helen went on. I waited 3 hours in line at the clerk's office, but they said you didn't see anyone without an appointment. Dear God, what have I done? He groaned, covering his face with his hands. You became the important man your father always wanted, she said sadly, but you forgot who you were inside. The room was completely silent, everyone absorbed by the dramatic scene unfolding before them. Prosecutor Michael Thompson looked on in horror, realizing his case had completely collapsed. Nanny, forgive me, the judge whispered. Forgive me for everything. You're already forgiven, my boy, she replied, stroking his face as she had when he was a child. But now you need to do the right thing. Richard Harrison nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Slowly, he returned to his chair and picked up the gavel he had dropped. This session is adjourned for 15 minutes, he announced, his voice still trembling. I want to see all the documents the defense has prepared. Sarah rushed to retrieve the folder with all the medical records, while Jennifer stared in disbelief at the complete turnaround in the situation. The prosecutor struggled to process what he had just witnessed. During the break, Judge Richard asked to speak privately with Mrs. Helen in his chambers. There, away from prying eyes, they could talk more intimately. Nanny, I don't understand, he said, sitting beside her on the sofa. How did you end up accused of theft? It was a misunderstanding, Richard, she explained patiently. I was looking for a gift for my granddaughter and walked past that jewelry store. I stopped to look at the display, but I never went inside. The cameras must have caught me then. And the day they say the robbery happened. I was at the hospital with little Emma. She's 6 and had pneumonia. Sarah brought all the papers that prove it. Richard shook his head, ashamed of his own behavior. Nanny, why didn't you tell me who you were from the start? I tried, son, she replied with a sad smile. But you wouldn't listen. And to be honest, I wasn't sure you'd remember me after all this time. How could I forget? He said, clutching her hands. You were the only one who showed me real love as a child. When my father sent you away, it wasn't your fault, she interrupted. You were only 12. But I should have stood up for you, he murmured. You should have told the truth about the money. Silence fell between them for a moment. It was an old wound that had never fully healed. Do you remember why my father fired you? Richard asked. Of course I remember, Mrs. Helen replied. You had taken $100 from his wallet to buy a gift for a classmate you liked. When he found out, you were so scared you couldn't tell the truth. And you took the blame for me. You were just a frightened child, Richard. I was an adult and knew I could handle the consequences. But because of that, you lost your job, lost the house you lived in. And you kept your father's trust, she finished. It was the right choice. Richard stood and walked to the window, gazing at the city below. You know what's ironic, Nanny Helen? He said without turning. I became a judge because I wanted to deliver justice. I wanted to make up for all the injustices I witnessed as a child. And today I almost committed the greatest injustice of my career against the person who deserves my respect and gratitude the most. The past is past, Richard, Mrs. Helen said, rising and walking to him. What matters is what you do from now on. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. Judge Richard was visibly transformed, and everyone noticed the shift in his demeanor. "Let's resume the session," he announced, tapping the gavel lightly. "I'd like to review the documents the defense has submitted." Jennifer, still in shock from everything she had witnessed, handed over all the medical records. Richard examined them carefully, confirming every detail of Mrs. Helen's presence at the hospital on the day of the alleged crime. "These documents unequivocally prove that the defendant was elsewhere at the time of the alleged offense," he declared solemnly. "Furthermore, I'd like to question the evidence presented by the prosecution." Prosecutor Michael Thompson swallowed hard, realizing the tide had turned completely. "Mr. Jewelry Store Manager," the judge called, addressing the man who had remained silent until then. "Can you guarantee the quality of the security footage submitted?" "Well, Your Honor, the cameras are old, and sometimes the image is a bit blurry," the manager answered nervously. "A bit blurry?" Richard repeated. "To the point where accurate identification isn't possible?" "It's possible, yes," the man admitted, clearly uncomfortable. Richard then turned to security guard Mark Peterson. "And you? Can you accurately describe the physical features of the person you supposedly saw?" Mark stammered, realizing his account was being seriously questioned for the first time. "It was a woman, short, grey hair." "Features that apply to thousands of women in this city," the judge observed coldly. "Can you swear under oath that it was this very woman here today?" I think so." "Thinking isn't enough in a courtroom, Mr. Peterson." The dismantling of the prosecution's case was methodical and merciless. Richard exposed every flaw, every inconsistency, every assumption that had been presented as fact. "In light of the evidence," he declared finally, "this court finds there is insufficient proof to sustain the charges. The defendant, Helen Marie Johnson, is acquitted of all counts." The relief in the room was palpable. Sarah rushed to embrace her mother, who remained as serene as she had been throughout the trial. Jennifer could hardly believe her first career victory. But Richard wasn't finished yet. "Additionally," he continued, "I order an investigation into possible evidence tampering in this case. The inconsistencies are too grave to ignore." The prosecutor, Michael Thompson, and the jewelry store staff paled. They had bet on a quick trial against a poor woman without the means to properly defend herself. "Court is adjourned," Judge Richard declared, striking the gavel for the last time. As the room emptied, the judge asked to speak with Mrs. Helen privately once more. "Nanny Helen, I need to apologize for much more than what happened today," he said as soon as they were alone. "What are you talking about, son?" "I've become exactly like my father," he confessed bitterly. "Harsh, cold, arrogant, treating ordinary people as if they were beneath me. How many injustices must I have committed over the years?" Mrs. Helen studied him with affection. Even after decades, she could still see the frightened boy behind the authoritative facade. "Richard, you still have time to change," she said softly. "You still have time to become the man you always had the potential to be." "How can I do that? How can I make up for all the wrong I've done?" "Start today, one case at a time, one person at a time," she replied. "Always remember that behind every case is a real person, with real feelings, with a real story." In the days that followed, news of the trial spread through the city. The transformation of Judge Richard Harrison became the talk of legal circles everywhere. But the deepest changes happened in his personal life. For the first time in decades, Richard began questioning his own attitudes and behaviors. He sought out a psychologist to work through childhood traumas and started reconnecting with his humanity. A week after the hearing, he showed up at Mrs. Helen's modest home in Riverdale, carrying a basket of fruit and a nervous smile. "Nanny Helen, I came to ask you something," he said, sitting in the humble living room that contrasted sharply with the opulence he was used to. "Go ahead, my boy. I want you to let me help you and your family. Not out of pity or obligation, but because it's the least I can do for the person who taught me what true love is." Mrs. Helen shook her head firmly. "Richard, I don't need charity. It's not charity, Nanny Helen, he insisted. It's gratitude, it's recognition, it's family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Something both had lost in different ways over the years. "Do you really want to do something for me?" she asked after a long silence. "Anything." "Then come for lunch this Sunday. Sarah is making feijoada, and little Emma is dying to meet the famous judge who saved Grandma." The smile that spread across Richard's face was the most genuine he'd worn in decades. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. The first Sunday lunch was a little awkward. Richard, accustomed to expensive restaurants and formal gatherings, wasn't quite sure how to behave in the simple family setting. But Emma, Mrs. Helen's 6-year-old granddaughter, quickly broke the ice. "Grandma said you were a very mischievous boy when you were little," she said, eyeing him curiously. "Is it true you broke a really expensive vase?" Richard laughed, a real spontaneous laugh he hadn't had in years. "Yes, it's true," he admitted, "and your grandma saved me from a huge scolding." "She saves me from Mommy's scoldings too," Emma whispered, making everyone laugh. Little by little, Richard became part of the family that welcomed him without judgment, without demands, just with the simple, genuine affection he had lost so long ago. In the courtroom, the changes were just as evident. Richard began to truly listen to people, to consider the circumstances behind crimes, to remember that justice and humanity could walk hand in hand. Mrs. Bennett, the veteran employee, remarked to her colleagues about the transformation. "He seems like a different man." Yesterday, he paused the trial to ask if the defendant had somewhere to leave her young children while serving her alternative sentence. "I've never seen that in 20 years of working here." Stories of the judge's change spread, inspiring other judges to rethink their own practices. Richard began giving lectures on humanizing justice, always sharing the story of how a simple woman had taught him the true meaning of his profession. Months later, during one of those Sunday lunches that had become a tradition, Sarah pulled Richard aside for a private conversation. "Richard, I need to thank you," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "For what, Sarah?" "For giving me back my mother." Richard looked at her, confused. "After that trial, after you two reunited, she became the strong woman I knew in childhood again," Sarah explained. "For years, she seemed lost, as if she'd left a part of herself in the past. Now she has that sparkle in her eyes again." It was true. Mrs. Helen had seemed rejuvenated in recent months, not physically, but spiritually. Reconnecting with Richard had closed a chapter left open for decades. "And you've changed too," Sarah continued. "My mother said you were a sad child. Now I see a man at peace." Richard nodded, moved. That was exactly how he felt, at peace with himself for the first time in decades. A year after the trial, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. He requested a transfer to a small-town courthouse where he could work closer to the people and the real problems of the community. "Nanny Helen, do you think I'm doing the right thing?" he asked during their farewell. "I'm proud of you, my son," she replied, straightening his tie as she had when he was a child. "You're following your heart, and that's always the right path. But I'll miss our Sundays." "Who says they have to end?" she smiled. "It's not so far away. And besides, now you have a real family waiting for you whenever you want to come back." In his new courthouse, Richard became known as the People's Judge. His rulings were fair but humane, always considering not just the cold letter of the law, but the real circumstances of the people involved. He created a community mediation program where many conflicts were resolved through dialogue before ever reaching the courtroom. He drew inspiration from his conversations with Mrs. Helen, who always said, "The best justice is the kind that heals, not just punishes." 2 years later, Richard received a National Award for Innovation in the Application of Justice. During his acceptance speech, he shared Mrs. Helen's story with an audience of judges and officials from across the country. "I learned that true justice doesn't come from codes or precedents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It comes from the ability to see the humanity in every person who stands before us. I learned this from a simple woman who taught me that love and wisdom sometimes come disguised in humility." In the audience, seated in a place of honor, Mrs. Helen watched him with pride, alongside Sarah and Emma. This was the family he had chosen, and the one that had chosen him back. After the ceremony, they dined together at an elegant restaurant. Emma, now 8 years old, played with the trophy while the adults talked. "Nanny Helen, there's something I've always wanted to ask you," Richard said. "Ask away, son." "Did you really forgive me for all the wrong I've done in life?" Mrs. Helen looked at him with those wise eyes that had seen so much suffering and so much overcoming. "Richard, it wasn't my place to forgive you," she said softly. "It was your place to forgive yourself, and from what I see, you finally have." He nodded, understanding the depth of those words. For decades, he had carried the guilt for what happened in his childhood, allowing it to turn him into a bitter and cold person. Reuniting with Mrs. Helen not only gave him the forgiveness he sought, but more importantly, taught him to forgive himself. "And now," he asked, "what's the next step?" "Now you keep being the good man you always were inside," she replied. "And remember every day that life gives us second chances, but we must have the courage to take them." 5 years after that trial that changed their lives, Richard decided to write a book telling the whole story. He wanted others to know how love and forgiveness can transform even the hardest of hearts. "Nanny Helen, can I tell our story?" he asked during a visit. "Of course, my boy," she answered. "But tell it right, okay? Tell them that love always wins in the end." The book became a national success. Similar stories began to emerge all over the country, people reconnecting with their past, families reuniting, justice gradually becoming more humane. Richard continued visiting Mrs. Helen regularly, now bringing his new family along. He had married a public defender who shared his ideals of social justice. "Nanny Helen, you changed much more than just my life," he said during one of these visits, watching his own children playing with Emma in the backyard. "How so, son?" "You changed the justice system of an entire country. Every judge who read my book, every person who heard our story, every family that reconciled, it all started with your courage in that courtroom." Mrs. Helen smiled, watching the children run around the yard. "It wasn't courage, Richard," she said. "It was just love. The love I always felt for that scared little boy I met so many years ago. And that love changed everything." "Love always changes everything," she replied, placing her hand on his shoulder. "We just need patience to see the results." That afternoon, as they prepared lunch together, Richard reflected on life's mysterious paths. If someone had told him years ago that his greatest lesson would come from an elderly woman being unjustly accused in his own courtroom, he would never have believed it. But there he was, a transformed man, surrounded by the family love had built, serving a justice that finally made sense in his heart. "Nanny Helen," he said, as he helped set the table. "Yes, my boy? Thank you for never giving up on me." "I would never give up on my boy," she answered, touching his face tenderly. "Not when you were a mischievous child. Not when you became a lost man. Mothers never give up, Richard, and you were always my son in my heart." Years later, when Mrs. Helen turned 80, Richard organized a party in her honor. Dozens of people whose lives she had touched in some way attended. Former employers, neighbors, other families she had helped over the years. During his speech, Richard told the story again of how she had changed his life, but this time he added a detail he had never shared publicly before. "When Nanny Helen found me hiding under that staircase, afraid and ashamed of what I had done, she didn't just comfort me. She knelt down, looked deep into my eyes and said, 'My angel, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is learning from them and becoming a better person.' Those words stayed with me my whole life, even when I ignored them for a long time." The party was emotional, but the most special moment came at the end, when everyone had already left. Richard, Sarah, Emma, now a teenager, and Richard's young children stayed behind to help clean up. "Nanny," said Emma, who had grown into an intelligent and caring young woman, "have you ever thought about writing your own memoirs?" "Memoirs?" Mrs. Helen laughed. "Who would want to read the memoirs of an old lady like me?" "I would," Richard said immediately. "I want my children to know exactly what the extraordinary woman who taught them about love and forgiveness was like. And I want my daughter to know," Sarah added, pointing to her growing belly. She was pregnant again. And I want all young people to know it's possible to change, no matter how old you are. Emma finished. Mrs. Helen looked at all of them, her Hart family, and felt a deep peace in her chest. "All right," she said finally, "but you'll have to help me. My memory isn't as sharp as it used to be." "We'll help," Richard promised. "It'll be our family project." And so began another chapter in the story of that family, built by love and strengthened by forgiveness. Mrs. Helen's memoirs became a second book, even more touching than the first, showing how a simple life lived with dignity could impact generations. Her legacy wasn't just in the stories she told, but in the lives she transformed. Richard continued changing the judicial system, one case at a time. Sarah became head nurse and created programs to humanize hospital care. Emma decided to study law, inspired by her grandmother's story and Uncle Richard. But perhaps Mrs. Helen's greatest legacy was showing that it's never too late to start over, that true love knows no social barriers, and that sometimes the simplest people carry the deepest wisdom. One Sunday afternoon, now very elderly, Mrs. Helen sat in her favorite chair, watching her family gathered in the backyard. Richard played with his children, Sarah helped Emma with her college studies, and the youngest generation ran happily among the trees. "Thank you, Lord," she murmured, looking up at the sky, "for letting me see that frightened boy become a good man, for showing me it's worth believing in people, even when they've given up on themselves." Richard saw her talking to herself and approached. "Who are you talking to, Nanny?" "I was giving thanks," she replied with a smile. "Thanks for living long enough to see you happy." "I'm the one who should thank you for coming into my life twice," he said, kissing her forehead. "First when I was a child, then when I was a lost adult." "The right people always come into our lives at the right time," she answered philosophically. "Sometimes you have to wait a little, but they always appear." That night, after everyone had left, Mrs. Helen sat on her porch gazing at the stars. She thought about the journey that had brought her there, the difficult years of her youth, the hard work of raising her children, the injustice of the trial that had turned into a blessing. Every hardship, every tear, every moment of pain had been worth it to reach this perfect present. A family united by unconditional love. Her last thought before falling asleep was a prayer of gratitude, not just for her own life, but for being chosen as an instrument of transformation in Richard's life, and through him in the lives of so many others. The next day, Richard found her sleeping peacefully in her chair, a serene smile on her face. She had passed as she had lived, at peace with herself and in harmony with the world. The funeral was a celebration of the extraordinary life of a simple woman. Hundreds of people attended, each with a story of how Mrs. Helen had touched their lives. Richard delivered the main speech, but his voice broke several times. "She taught me that true nobility doesn't come from titles or possessions," he said, fighting back tears. "It comes from the ability to love unconditionally and forgive without limits. She was the noblest person I ever knew, and I'm honored to have been her son in heart." Today, years after her passing, Mrs. Helen's legacy lives on. There's a school named after her in the neighborhood where she lived, a restorative justice program based on her teachings, and dozens of stories passed down through generations. Richard, now retired, dedicates his time to lectures about humanizing justice. He always ends his talks by sharing Mrs. Helen's story and leaving this message. Somewhere out there, someone is waiting for you to be brave enough to do the right thing, for you to be humble enough to admit your mistakes, for you to be wise enough to learn from those who have love to teach. That person may be closer than you think, hidden in simplicity, carrying the wisdom that could change your life forever. Emma, now a respected lawyer, keeps a portrait of Mrs. Helen in her office. Whenever she faces a tough case, she looks at that photo and asks herself, what would Grandma do? The answer always guides her to the right decision. The story of Mrs. Helen and Richard has become a symbol of hope in the American justice system. It shows that justice doesn't have to be cold to be effective, that humanity and the law can walk together, and that one person with courage and love can transform generations. But perhaps the most important lesson of this entire story is that we never know who might be our guardian angel, our life teacher, our path to redemption. It could be someone simple, humble, with no titles or social recognition. Someone who just needs a chance to show that true love can move mountains and change hearts. And that sometimes when we think we're judging someone, we're actually being judged by life itself, tested on our ability to recognize nobility when it comes disguised in simplicity. The end of the story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of this touching story? Could you feel Richard's transformation through Mrs. Helen's unconditional love? Share in the comments which part moved you the most, and tell us if you've ever experienced something similar, where someone special changed your life unexpectedly. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other stories that will stir your emotions. Your companionship means so much to us.